I'm Sam Bizek of BossStrength.com, and today I'm going to be talking about a technique called post-activation potentiation, a technique that you can start implementing in your training program today and set a new PR almost immediately. So before I get into the actual technique of post-activation potentiation, what I want to do is give you a little rundown of some things that you may or may not already know. The first of which is different fiber types. So you've probably heard about different muscle fiber types, such as like slow twitch and fast twitch. Now that's the truth. There are slow twitch muscle fibers and fast twitch muscle fibers. Basically what that means for smaller slow twitch muscle fibers, that means that the fiber itself actually contracts a little bit slowly and is more fatigue resistant. So you take somebody who's like an endurance runner, they'll typically have a higher ratio of small twitch fatigue resistant muscle fibers than say a Olympic weightlifter who would have a much higher ratio of the fast twitch muscle fibers because they have a need to develop force at a very high rate. When you train, these different fibers are recruited sequentially. So everybody has at least some small slow twitch muscle fibers and fast twitch muscle fibers. It's just the way that you train and genetics too determines how these muscle fibers actually work. When you first start lifting on a daily basis, these muscle fibers start at the slower, more fatigue-resistant muscle fibers and kind of sequentially recruit the faster twitch, high rate of force development muscle fibers. Now, just to get into something that's a little bit more in-depth, you have something that's called motor units. So these muscle fibers that are in your body don't just contract on their own. They have to receive a signal from your brain down through your spinal cord into the muscle to kind of tell the muscle how to function. So basically you think about making a movement, whether that be slow or fast, and the brain sends an electrical impulse down the motor unit into the muscle fiber. And the rate and the frequency in which this message is sent from the brain to the muscle determines how the muscle actually contracts. So you can expect if you have a very fast and high rate and frequency of impulses being sent from the brain to the muscle, this will make the muscle contract at a very fast rate and be able to produce force very rapidly. If the rate and frequency of that impulse is lower, you can expect that the muscle is going to contract slowly and be more fatigue resistant, something that you would see with like an endurance runner. Yeah, I get it. It's a lot of information, but in its basic terms, it's actually pretty simple. The way that the electrical impulse is sent down the motor unit is actually what determines how the muscle fiber actually works. So you can expect if the impulse going down the motor unit has a very high rate and a very high frequency, you can expect that the muscle will act in a similar manner, being able to produce force very rapidly. If the impulse is very slow and infrequent, you can expect that the muscle will do the same. It will act slowly and fire infrequently and be very fatigue resistant, something that you would see in like an endurance runner. So now that you have a pretty basic understanding of how muscle fibers and motor units actually work, we can get into what post-activation potentiation is and why it actually works. So just for example, if you can say bench 225 for 8 repetitions, okay, you would expect that the motor units and muscle fibers would be contracting in a certain way. And that way would be a little bit different than if you were, say, doing 315 for a single or a double. Well, what that difference is basically when you're doing 225, the way that the muscle fibers and the motor units actually function is a little bit slower and a little bit less infrequent than when you're, say, benching 315. So the point of post-activation potentiation is to actually go above the weight that you're planning on using for the day and then dropping back down to that. And in essence, doing so should improve your performance. Okay, so if you were to take a day where you were doing some high volume bodybuilding style, and let's say that you bench 225 pounds for 8 reps, as I mentioned a little bit ago. If you just go up to 225 and do it for 8 repetitions, that's fine. That's what you normally can do. With post-activation potentiation, what you'll actually do is you'll go above 225 for a couple repetitions, never to failure. The point of it isn't to fatigue the muscle per se, it's to activate higher order motor units and have them fire more frequently and at a higher rate. The cool thing is that once you work up to a certain weight and have activated these muscle fibers and motor units, they actually stay activated at that level for a little bit of time after you're done. So say like around 20 minutes. The cool thing is you can go up to a certain weight and then drop down to your normal weight. And these motor units and muscle fibers will still be activated to the extent that they would be needed for the higher amount of weight. So it basically makes what normally would be a max repetition of 8 reps at 225 feel much easier and much lighter. When you do this, you can expect that after you drop back down to 225, that you'll either be able to do more repetitions. So if you normally could do 8, you'll now be able to do like maybe 10, 11, or 12. Or even better, you might be able to increase the amount of weight that you use for 8 repetitions or even more. It's just a way to activate muscle fibers and motor units to a greater extent than if you were to just work up to 225 and start there. The thing about post-activation potentiation is that its effect in the amount of weight that you need to use will vary widely from an individual to individual. The truth is that if you're a beginner, you shouldn't be using post-activation potentiation, because if you go too far above your normal working weight, you run the risk of being way too fatigued and your performance can actually diminish. Really, this is for people who have been training for a couple of years and can move a significant amount of weight, because the more weight that you can move for repetitions means that you can probably go a little bit higher above that working weight for fewer repetitions. The second thing to keep in mind is that you need to decide what sort of weight and repetitions you want to work with primarily for the day. So for example, are you going to be training for strength? So are you going to do a pretty high weight, low repetition sets? Or are you going to be doing more bodybuilding style, high volume? So are you going to be doing like sets of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12? The reason that you need to decide that is because it will determine the way that you use the post-activation potentiation sets. So for example, I'm just going to use myself as an example because it's easier for me to explain it in a way that other people can understand. So let's say, for instance, I'm doing a high volume day. For 8 to 10 repetitions, I can normally do like 275 pounds on the bench. If I decide that the way that I'm going to be lifting for the day is to use that repetition range, what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to work up to like 315 for a double. Okay, and then I'm going to, after I do that, I'm going to wait a couple minutes, and then I'm going to drop back down to 275 and try to get 10 repetitions, or maybe 11 or 12 repetitions, maybe 1 or 2 above what my repetition max could be. Okay, this is in contrast to if strength was my primary goal of the day. So let's say that I can do 315 for a set of 3 or 4. What I would probably do is I would work up to probably 335 or 340 for a single, not to failure, just kind of get motor units and muscle fibers activated, and then I'll drop back down to 315. And when I drop back down to 315, I might try and go for an extra repetition or 2 from what I normally would be able to do. Alternatively, I might try and take that 3 to 4 repetitions that I normally would give at 315 and jump up to 320 or 325, just trying to set like a new weight PR. So basically, in my experience, the working weight. So like for me, like 275 for 8 repetitions would be my working weight. What I'm doing for the day determines how I'm going to be using post-activation potentiation. So I suggest if you have the primary goal of increasing hypertrophy, you're probably going to be in the higher rep ranges during your working set. So I would suggest going maybe 15 to 25 pounds above your normal weight and just doing a couple sets, maybe 1 or 2 sets of 2 repetitions. I can't stress it enough, you don't want to go to failure. If you go to failure and you drop back down to your normal working weight, there's a really good chance that you'll fail or you'll regress. You'll actually end up doing less repetitions than you normally would had you not gone above. Again, this is a learning process, okay? This is a process that you have to figure out for yourself. Me telling you how much weight you need to go above your working weight is very difficult because everybody's an individual with different levels of strength. So what you need to do is you just really need to feel it out for yourself. Try starting with going 5 pounds above your working weight, or maybe 10 pounds, maybe 15 pounds. It doesn't matter. It's all individualized to your own level of strength, okay? If you're going up in weight during your PAP sets, your post-activation potentiation sets, and then you're dropping back down and you're getting worse, that means one of 2 things. Either you went too heavy and you were too close to failure, or 2, you probably aren't trained enough to require using this method. Okay, so you have to really pay attention to your own body and you have to listen to it to determine what weight you need to use and what will actually benefit you. So now that you have a little bit better understanding of what post-activation potentiation is, I just want to go over some key points that you should make sure you understand before trying to use this technique. The first of which is, if you are a beginner, I would not suggest using post-activation potentiation. The reason for this is because it's very likely that the difference in weight between your working sets and the sets that you would do for post-activation potentiation are probably not very different, meaning that the amount of weight that you're using for a maximum repetition is probably not much larger than what you would do for repetition maximums, okay? It's because of this that you run the risk of becoming too close to failure on the post-activation potentiation sets, which when you drop back down could mean that you have a decrease in performance. So if you consider yourself to be a beginner, meaning you've been training for like 6 months to a year, I would suggest just continuing what you're doing, trying to practice progressive overload, and don't use post-activation potentiation until your maximum weight is much larger than what you would normally use for a working set. Secondly, I strongly advise that you determine what your primary goal of the training session for your day is before you do your PAP sets. The reason for this is because your primary goal will determine how heavy you go during your post-activation potentiation sets. For example, if your primary goal of the day is to do a high repetition set, I would suggest not going as heavy on your PAP sets as if you were to, say, have the primary goal of increasing strength for the day, okay? In addition to that, you'll probably do maybe 1 or 2 more repetitions than you normally would during your strength day. If your primary goal of the day is to increase strength, I suggest going much heavier than you would on your volume days. Okay, this will activate higher order motor units to a greater extent, which will then correlate with a greater rate of force development. Okay, so that basically means that you'll end up being a little bit stronger and it will pander itself better to increasing strength. And lastly, and probably the most important thing about post-activation potentiation, is that you want to ensure that on your PAP sets, you don't go to failure. The biggest mistake that I see a lot of people make is, especially with like their first or second set, they just go to failure. The problem is that decreases performance, and it's no different than if you're doing post-activation potentiation. Okay, just going heavy and going to failure will diminish your performance, and you want to avoid that at all costs. Okay, post-activation potentiation is a technique that you'll need to use a lot of trial and error on. Okay, you just want to remember that you don't want to go to a failure. Everybody is an individual with a different strength and ability level, okay? So you need to try out different weights and see how it affects your performance. If it increases your performance, continue doing what you're doing and maybe try out going a little bit heavier. So that about does it for the topic of post-activation potentiation. Post-activation potentiation is a topic that is of great interest to me, and it's something that I personally use on a day-to-day basis when I'm in the gym. Using this style of technique has literally packed crazy amount of weight onto my total. I use it pretty much every time I lift, and almost every time I set a new personal record, whether that be with weight, repetitions, or both. And I truly hope that this video kind of gives you an idea of how you can begin to implement it into your own training and set the same kinds of PRs. If you are interested, I'm posting links in the description of this video to my personal website, www.bossstrength.com, where you can view and even try out for free my 12-week strength and hypertrophy program called Potentiate, which actually uses this technique in addition to a couple others that I'll be discussing in future videos. It's an awesome program. It's a program that I use myself, and it also comes with a 100% money-back guarantee. Best of all, you get to try it for 3 weeks free. So there's literally no risk and just some reward. So if you like this video, consider giving it a like, maybe even hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.